Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today, I am on with Dr. Matthew Goff. We're going to be talking about the Apocrypha and the idea of it being in the biblical canon and different views on that and how it originated and different views people had through history. And maybe we can figure a little bit out about how it came to be and how it came to be in our specific biblical text that we have today. How are we doing today, Dr. Goff?
Thank you. Good. Glad to be here.
Awesome. All righty. So you wrote a book, kind of like a popular level book on the Apocrypha, and you went in great detail for a lot of the different texts of the Apocrypha. But we're going to be talking about a very specific chapter on the kind of the formation of different views people had on it.
hmm
So I would highly recommend people check out that book as it goes into really great detail on the different texts.
Copy
Yes,
is still there.
there you go. And it'll be in the description.
Mm.
So I highly recommend. I found a lot of value in it. But we're talking, as I said before, we're going to talk about specifically what the canon idea and different views people held about that. So let's start with what is the Apocrypha? Can you get into that?
Mm. So yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. Glad to be here. And first, let me say, I really want to echo what Zach was saying, that the book is for a popular audience, and the idea that if it's designed for someone who has heard about the Apocrypha, or that you heard oh, there's something called Tobit or First Maccabees, and you want to learn a little bit more, that's what the book is designed for.
Hmm.
So you asked about the Apocrypha as a general category, right? Right, Zach? All right. So the word literally means hidden. And when you and it's an ancient term, it's a Greek term, a Latin term, and you see it in term like you see it in English today, like when people will talk about, like, oh, Bigfoot, like that's an apocryphal legend, or the Loch Ness monster, like that's apocryphal. And what people mean by that is that stories that they think are true but actually aren't. That's kind of the legacy of the term. And in the book I try to unpack that and where it comes from. So and first, well, I guess we'll emphasize that in antiquity you have people using this term for texts they don't like very much. And it has to do with the issue of what's, I guess, one critical thing to emphasize is, for us, the Bible is a fixed thing. It's an established text. The idea of like changing it doesn't make sense. But we actually see in our own context that there's different groups with different Bibles. And here I mean, in particular, there's different Christian groups with different forms of the Old Testament. Like in chapter 1, I get into that a little bit. And that's actually the key difference. Like you don't see the same variations today with the New Testament, but like it's really kind of different Christian groups today have different Old Testaments. And that's a first clue to the story we're talking about. And basically, yes, yes, that's exactly, yes, that's very helpful. That's very helpful. And people were using this term apocrypha in antiquity, and it's for terms they didn't like very for books they didn't like very much, but meaning they were using it for people for books that other people thought were in the Bible. And it has to do with different that the fact that there were different conceptions of scripture back then. And to make a long story short, the Protestants took that older heritage, um, uh, um, and used it to understand part of their own scriptural tradition. Like now, I can talk about that a little bit now, or if you want to do that a little bit later, Zach, or what would you like?
Yeah. So let's get into just at least for now, just a little bit. If you didn't add, did you have anything more you wanted to add about how the word apocrypha is used throughout history? So, like at the very beginning, it's used a little bit differently than
Yeah.
later. Is that correct?
Yeah. So yeah, I wanted to just see what you wanted to ask. So yes, like there are that we have early Christian texts that use the term in a very positive way, meaning
Hmm.
like one of the questions is, what does hidden mean? like we have some early Christian texts, like in the Nag Hammadi Codex, where the idea is that like different Christian figures, like James or so on, like that there's a secret book,
Hmm.
like a hidden, like a book with hidden truth, apocrypha, and a good thing, a good. The idea that Christians have extra knowledge and extra revelation from some of these foundational Christian literatures. And to make a long story short, like in the fourth century CE, when Christianity changes from sort of a loose network of a kind of an underground religion without any group, any sort of authority figures, like with a lot of power, able to kind of say like what Christianity is or should be, that begins to change in the fourth century, and that's an important part of like this apocrypha tradition. And there in the fourth century you begin when Christianity like turns to a religion with power, like where the Roman emperors begin to convert to Christianity. It becomes less of an underground religion, and more of an official religion. And then you have beginning to have an official group with power. And then you began to have efforts to sort of define official figures of defining the religion in various ways. And this big like, and here you have the sort of the formation of the canon. You have the idea of like a formalization of the religion, and a big part of that is those folks who understood themselves as Orthodox started calling other groups heretics, that like groups that have been around for a long time, so that those other groups that like had the apocrypha that use the apocrypha in a good way, like those people didn't like those what those heretics were doing. It wasn't simply about texts. The idea is that there were Christians that didn't like each other, and the idea is that like some of them, like the people they didn't like, revered certain books that they didn't revere in the same way. So the thinking was like bad scripture reverts, like turns into produces bad Christians, was kind of the thinking. So the idea that certain groups that have now been long forgotten about revered some of these things led to some of these like Orthodox Christians to condemn certain books, and that's where the term apocrypha, so they don't like anything in that category. They don't like at all. Like it's really a despised category. Um, uh, um, but then it's a whole other thing that it actually becomes a biblical category in the Protestant period, like later on. But in the early Christians, if you called something apocryphal, like you didn't like it, right? And radically, meaning the idea is that is books that other people thought were biblical that you want to say is non-biblical. I'm like, I'm not even sure there's we need a word for that now, because people generally don't dispute about what books are in the Bible or not. Like, wouldn't you say that, Zach? It's like what the issue they were trying to solve is not something like that's an issue today, I'd say.
Yeah. Yeah, unless you're talking about maybe between denominations or, Catholics, Protestants, whatever. Yeah, so kind of more on that topic there. So let me get that pulled up here. Yeah, so as people can see on the screen, the different, groups, the Orthodox Christians, Protestants, Catholics today, and even Eastern Orthodox have a lot of different variation there. But there's a lot of different books that are not in maybe the Protestant Bible that are in like the Catholic Bible. So maybe you've been asking,
Yeah,
why do you have that, and why are there certain books not in there? And that's
yeah,
we're going to talk about that today.
yeah,
Um, but on this topic, it wasn't always like this. There was a time period where there was no idea of a canon. Is that correct? Can you
yeah.
talk about that? In the book you say, in the Judaism of the Hellenistic age, scripture was not envisioned as a closed off canon of text. Can you talk about that?
Yes. So here we're going to back up even earlier to the Hellenistic period. So one macro point is biblical studies as a field, from which like we get the critical editions of the Hebrew and the Greek, which all Bibles translations are based on now. Like it was based, they're based on particularly for the on the Old Testament, like it's based on medieval manuscripts, meaning like the oldest manuscripts we have of the Hebrew Bible. Like it's all like I'd say the most important book very few people have heard of is the Leningrad Codex. This is the the one manuscript that like the vast majority of Old Testament, like you guys, people listening probably know the Old Testament is translated from the Hebrew. But then you could ask the question, well, where did they get the Hebrew? And the answer is the Leningrad Codex, and because it's the oldest complete Hebrew Bible manuscript, and that document was produced in the year 1008 CE, CE, not BCE. Like it actually has a preface, which literally is dated by the Islamic calendar, like because it was produced by a Jewish minority in Egypt, in Islamic Egypt. So the point is, a lot of our understandings of the Bible is based on like medieval manuscripts. And then the whole other part of it is like we are in the world of the printing press. We're in the world, like we are in the print era, where the idea that a single form of a book can be mass produced, like that changed that, like all of the stuff happened before all this stuff. So the idea that our understanding of what texts are and what they should be is shaped by that print world. And then you go back, so you go further back, and so like in the 40s when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, meaning like the my point here, Zach, is biblical studies as a field did not have a lot of ancient Jewish texts on which to base their ideas, their understanding of the material. And then so that all changed in the 40s when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and now we have a significant corpus of actual ancient texts from ancient Israel, about 930 or so. Some are like full scrolls that are like 7 meters long when you unroll them, and others are just like little scraps. But they're from the 3rd century BCE, most are from the second century BCE, 1st century BCE, and lo and behold, they don't necessarily have the same like form of the text that the later Masoretic text. Some, it's interesting, some of those Dead Sea Scrolls match the later Masoretic text really nicely, but there's all sorts of other, there's a lot of, so now we can actually encounter ancient Jewish scriptural texts, a window into the conceptions of textuality and scripture they had then that we didn't have before. And they don't just give us new knowledge, they show us they were thinking about these things in different ways. So they don't have a word for Bible, for example, and the idea, like we see, because we have multiple copies of Genesis and some of these other texts, and you can see that there's variation. You can see that the idea of sort of a diversity of different forms of texts, like it was within one sectarian group, like the idea of kind of scriptural diversity didn't was not a problematic thing for them. They've revered as scriptural books which most of us haven't heard of before. For example, Enoch and Jubilees. And this is also, I'd say, a window in, this gives us a better picture into the window, the conception of scripture out of which Christianity came, because the New Testament actually cites Enoch as scripture, even though most people today like haven't heard of it today. But you can see when you look at the material that there isn't just scripture as one thing, but they were rewriting it, interpreting it, how, like, and people were engaging the material, and how they were engaging the material reflected how they wrote the material. So you can tell that people were like thinking through details about key stories that we can see, like in Genesis, for example, but that led to them, those interpretations and discussions and study sessions led to them writing it down in different ways. Like for us, the idea of scripture is here, and then interpretate, like these are two very different categories. People have all sorts of different interpretations, but they're interpreting one thing. And in this period we're talking about, those two categories are mixed up in a way that doesn't fully make sense to us. And that's like one of the key issues in the that I'd say in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They clearly have scripture, but they don't have canon, but in the sense of, like, if you mean by that a closed, fixed set of texts that you can't like touch or change.
Right, and that's a really big thing to point out because we think of canon as a specific set of books, but their books were changing. So the idea of canon didn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, like and you get a sense, and that's right. And you like so, for example, one other window into is not just kind of discussions of book lists. That I mean, they didn't really have that sort of thing back then. Me like that itself is kind of a canonizing question, like which books are in and which are out. But like if you look at the metaphors they're using for the Torah, this gives you a like a window into what we're talking about. One of like one of the first texts that describes the Torah, their first 5 books of the Old Testament, is Ben Sira from the 2nd century BC, and they're the metaphors like are interesting, they keep changing. Like they imagine they talk about wisdom as a woman, like in first as a mist from God's mouth, and then like how it becomes a woman, evoking that tradition in Proverbs that wisdom is a woman. Then she turns into a tree, and this is like the wisdom is saying this, and then it says that the tree grows in Israel, and that the fruit she has, what she encourages people to eat, is then it says that's the Torah, and then it starts talking about Torah as water, like but not just, but like as expansive, growing, like overflowing water, like the idea of kind of abundant waters. And my point, Zach, is that those the multiplicity of those metaphors, they emphasize abundance, excess, like growth. Those are not metaphors that emphasize like a fixity, like or an unchangingness, that what makes scripture important. The idea that it's not just water in the sense of life nurturing, it's that it's expansive and dynamic, and like the idea that they kind of understood the tradition as like that gives you a window into how they understood scripture as important, and the idea that the tradition was dynamic and vital in ways that you don't get with language of fixity or unchangingness. We also see for one of the metaphors for the Dead Sea for Torah and the Dead Sea Scrolls, there it's also water. Like so the idea that that they're like there's one text where they understand the teacher of righteousness, their founder. Like there's one language they're interpreting language from the scene in Numbers 21, where they're digging, they're kind of poking a staff into the desert to make a well, and in the community they say that staff represents our teacher, the teacher of righteousness, and the water that comes out, like that's the Torah. So the idea is that again, it's kind of like it's bubbling up, it's dynamic, it's expansive, like so the metaphors they were using don't fit like fit a kind of expansiveness that we see in the textual evidence, Zach.
That's really interesting. Okay, and so that's the Hellenistic age. So when did that kind of end?
Well, so what we know, so it's interesting. Like you even go, so even you go to our earliest Septuagint manuscripts, like the earliest examples of Christians having something called the Old Testament, that the manuscripts for that, like even there, like in that orthodoxing process, there's still books that and even on the New Testament side too, those manuscripts include books which are not in our New Testament today. Like some of those manuscripts have a Christian text called the Shepherd of Hermas. Some of them have a Christian text called the Didache. So my point is, we don't have like one sort of like clear. I wish I could give a simple answer to your question, but like I'd say it's a more gradual process. But the first evidence we have for a kind of, let's call it a canonizing consciousness, where in here I mean the specific evidence where people saying not just that there's something called the Torah and that it's important, but that there's something called the Torah which they're associating with a particular number of books, and that is our earliest evidence for that is in the 1st century CE, and there it's really interesting. So we have one Jewish historian by the name of Josephus in that time, and in a book called Against Appian, he says that the Jewish scriptures have 22 books, and his point, like his point is that like, oh, you Greeks have like hundreds and thousands of books, and it's all a mess. And yes, yes, and notice here he has a different, like what I'm glad you brought this, because he says, he keeps on to say like that there are other books after that, but but they're not as important. And there's a lot of debate about how to understand this phrase. Like this, the 13 is kind of one of those sections. Yeah, the 5 of the Torah, and then there's 13 more, and then he says there's 4 additional ones. So there's some sort of categorization of scripture that's a little different there, but but it's interesting that it's the number 22, which I'll come back to, because there's another text from the same period, and maybe you have a overhead of that, a text called Fourth Ezra, which for many people, for many Christians, was scriptural for a long time. It's in the Gutenberg Bible, and many of the radical Protestants, including some of the early Baptists, it was also very important for them because it was a very apocalyptic book. They read it alongside the book of Revelation. And what you find in Fourth Ezra is that a renewal of the Torah, and there you have the idea that the law is 24 books, but also that God revealed an additional 70 books for the wise. And we can talk about, there's a big debate about what that means. So, and here the idea is Josephus says 22, and Fourth Ezra says 24. And one thing we can do with that knowledge is sort of line up Old Testament books and how are they counting them. And if you look at the Jewish Bible today, like, there's like 39, but it gets at the issue of how you count the books. And so, for example, are the 12 minor prophets 12 books or one book? And there's a kind of, at one level, you would think it's a very simple thing, counting a number of books, but you actually see them reaching different numbers. And one very important thing, which I'll stress, is it was very important for those early Jews and the first Christians to say that the Old Testament was either 22 or 24 books. And why? Well, one of the debates is that, like, well, we could read that number in a literal sense, but it's also possible, and many of the early Christians talk about this. And it kind of like the question here, Zach, is like, what's it a number? What does a number mean? And what a number of these early Christians emphasize is that the Hebrew alphabet, depending on like has 22, or depending on how you count it, 24. So meaning like the idea there is like there was an interest in understanding, this is a window into scripture from the time. The idea that the number of books should correlate to the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And there the idea perhaps is like, and some of the texts suggest this, that the idea is not simply like a fixed book, but the idea that there's a correlation between scripture and the Hebrew language, meaning like that it's not simply, that actually fits with the expansiveness of scripture we find in the period, meaning like that yes, it's that by calling it that number of books, it's kind of saying all things. It represents all of the Hebrew language. So meaning it's not simply like and probably a little bit of both of those things was going on. And certainly later on, you have that numbers being those 22 or 24 being used in a sort of a literal sense, so like what books should be in and what should be out. But there's another dimension to the number that's very important, that echoes that older thing I was talking about in the Hellenistic period. Like the sense that the scripture can say all things by using that number of books.
So just for some clarity for my audience, so you think, well, first on that line, I got the right quote, right? Second Esdras,
Yeah,
which is four
yeah,
Esdras. Okay, all
yeah,
right.
yes, yes. That's exactly
So
right.
that's what you were talking about there. So
Exactly.
we get two texts very early in, a little bit after Jesus' time, that seem to be the first times where we have Jewish writers putting a number to their
Exactly.
texts.
Exactly.
But there's still the question. So you would say that they definitely had a canon at this point, or you don't think that's
I
so
would say
clear?
I'd say more canonizing.
Hmm.
because it's not clear at the time. Like you see it in like the text you're reading. Like it's very important for this because they're using like because if you read the text you have here, there's not a sense of like apocrypha, like, oh, there's other books but they're bad, but like there's 24 books, and that's what should be made, like, for everyone, made public. But then there's other books, 70, that like are not dismissed, but like but it's not necessarily it's for all Israel. Like here in your text, it's for the wise. So the idea that there's kind of other, so like one way to think about it, and like our understanding of Scripture is that it's one thing, and one thing that I think is helpful to understand ancient conceptions of Scripture is maybe in a way the term Scripture itself isn't maybe the best like the idea here is they were thinking of different books as having different values and different degrees of like different textual categories and different like, and that they were thinking about in different ways, because here in this text, which we don't find in Josephus, like Israel has 24 books, that's the law. But like it's not like everything else is bad. There's 70 books for the wise. And does that mean like things like that sort of nerds like me would read, but the ordinary person wouldn't? And the whole idea of 70 itself means, like, in many cases the number 70 meant kind of like a totality, like everything. It was so here again, maybe we shouldn't read the number 70 in a literal sense, but the idea that there was just a lot of other books. But they're making some sort of distinction in Fourth Ezra, which takes us in a canonizing direction.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. So, of course, they might have had different views of what scripture was in general, like what that means. So
Yeah,
obviously today we're going to think, okay, that
yeah,
means like super inspired. Some people would even say dictated. So there's
yeah,
that could be
yeah.
very different. So that's
And and I'd
from
also,
a
oh,
yeah,
go ahead.
what
Sorry.
I was just going to say from a 21st century mindset who kind of grew up in that, that might even be just hard to conceptualize in general.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I appreciate that. Like if any of your listeners, if they feel like their minds are blown, like, you're welcome. And let me emphasize one other key point for this, that um is the Septuagint. And that, because this is very, very important for what we're talking about.
Mhm.
Meaning, like those texts we were just talking about, they were talking about the Old Testament in terms of the Hebrew canon. And you see a lot of early Christian like leaders emphasizing that. And the point, and so when we look at the Old Testament, we are reading a text translated from the Hebrew. And that makes a whole lot of sense. Those texts were written in Hebrew. But like what I'd emphasize to you, Zach, and your Christian listeners, is that is not how the early Christians experienced Scripture. um, the New Testament, some of it might have been earlier in Aramaic, but we our oldest evidence for it is in Greek, and the literature and the context in which Christianity flourished, Greek was the dominant language. And when they are citing and engaging Scripture in that New Testament and early Christian world, they are not engaging it in Hebrew. They are engaging it in Greek. And yes, and it's the term for it is the LXX. Again, that number, that's the number 70. But the idea here is that there was an ancient effort to translate Scripture by Jews in the over like in the second and first centuries BCE, and meaning Greek was the dominant language. This was for Jews primarily in Egypt, in Alexandria. And Greek was, in the same way that you go to a synagogue today in the States, like you'll find the biblical text maybe in Hebrew, but probably in English because it's the dominant language. And so you have an ancient effort to translate Scripture from Hebrew into Greek. And then, to make a long story short, the Hebrew canon became what was dominant in what became Rabbinic Judaism. and the Septuagint was not continued in Judaism, it became the Christian Old Testament. And here, what's very, very important for the discussion is when you look at the books of the Old Testament, and you can see this on what Zach has helpfully put it, they include a number of books which are not in the Hebrew Bible. The one key scriptural fact that's important for this whole discussion is the ancient Greek canon, and here I mean the Septuagint, was larger than the ancient Hebrew canon, like which became the Bible of rabbinic Judaism. And you can these are basically the books that are there. The three categories are our earliest Septuagint manuscript. These are all different manuscripts of the Septuagint. These are all the earliest manuscripts of the Christian Old Testament, and you can see that they have all of these books. And you can also see in the chart that like there's some variety with this material with differences amongst themselves. So for a lot of that Septuagint heritage, like that's what a lot of those New Testament authors were engaging, and that's what a lot of the early Christian authors were engaging. So you find very early Christian authors, Tertullian or something like that, citing Tobit or Judith as just as if it was scripture, like, and meaning like they're writing in Greek and they're citing the Greek scriptures. And so thinking about that, understanding that Greek canon as sort of normative for the first Christians is very, very important. And Now, do you have a question about that? I can't see you over the do you have a I'm happy to sort of go on about that, but if you have a question, Zach, or you want something you want to chime in. Oh,
I did have one more question before we get into that.
yeah,
So, kind of holding back just a little bit there. So, in your book, you talked about Book of Enoch and Jubilees.
yeah,
So, they're typically not considered part of this, what they call Apocrypha, at least today.
yeah,
Like, they're not in the Catholic Bibles, they're not even in
yeah,
most Eastern Orthodox Bibles. So,
yeah.
could you briefly talk about their history as far as
Yes,
were
I'd be
they
happy.
considered inspired? Were they considered scripture?
Yeah. So, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but the term apocrypha, as we are you normally use it, has a specific Protestant heritage and is a specific Protestant textual category, which was used in relation to the Catholic Old Testament.
Hmm.
And so, a lot of the stuff we're talking about is stuff the Protestants took out of the Catholic Old Testament. But what I like about your question is that that whole issue, as important as it is, does not explain the whole range of diversity we are talking about. And there's stuff in the Orthodox, in the Eastern Orthodox Bible that aren't in the Catholic Old Testament. So Luther never like railed against them and didn't take it out because it wasn't in the Bible he was railing against, like Third Maccabees, for example. And one of the and here what Zach is getting at is if you look at one of the oldest Christian continual Christian communities, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which their king Oksana converted in the 4th century, and part like a significant part of that country in East Africa has been Christian ever since. And they're in their scriptures they have a number of things so the text that Zach showed, like with Second Esdras, that's in their Old Testament.
Hmm.
It's also that book is also often included in the Russian Orthodox Bible, but it's only the Russians and the Ethiopians today that have that book, and they have other books too. Most people will know the New Testament has a First and Second Corinthians, but the Ethiopian Bible has a Third Corinthians, and like there's a whole range of books and but most important for our purposes is they have something called Enoch, the Book of Enoch, and they have something called the Book of Jubilees, and both of which fell out of Christian usage in the 4th century. But if you why except in Ethiopia, in but it was still continued in many ways. We could talk about that. but in terms of included in Bibles, it wasn't like it fell out then. But you go early. But then if you're interested in that initial world of Christian scripture and the New Testament, like then Enoch, and this stuff is actually important. Like I said, the New Testament letter of Jude cites Enoch as scripture. Tertullian, one of the first Christian or early Christian authors, like some of the earliest Latin Christian texts we have, he actually uses for the book of Enoch the same verse that a lot of evangelicals use today to understand the inspiration of Scripture. Second Timothy 3:16, saying that first Enoch is inspired, and we can talk about what that means. The Greek is theopneumatos, meaning like God breathed into it, emphasis of sort of that it's divine, and it doesn't necessarily. They're using it in ways that we don't use it, in the sense of that it's infallible or unchanging, but they're using that language for Enoch. We actually, and I'll just mention this, the Enoch stuff. I don't know, like when you guys hear this, if it means that like I wish Enoch was in my Bible, or like thank God it's not in my Bible. It basically is, the core of it is a radical retelling of the flood story. The floods, Genesis really shows a lot of emphasis in the flood itself, and who's on the ark, and but it actually says very little about what happened on earth that led to the flood. Like it's emphasis on violence, but it doesn't say much. And the book of Enoch, its oldest part, gives a much fuller accounting of the what happened. And if you look in the beginning of Genesis 6, it says the sons of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim, a term for angels, admired and were attracted to women on earth and slept with them. So a whole issue of depicting angels in ways that we don't understand, like we would agree with today, like it's kind of rapey, actually. And then and it's a sign that this was the sex represents a kind of a violation of the separation of the boundaries between heaven and earth. And you see this with the idea of the offspring of the women are these monstrous giants. And according to the Ethiopic, the giants were like 3,000 cubits tall, like a mile and a half, or so. And they're chaotic. They eat the food of all the people. Then they start eating the people, and then they start eating each other, and this leads to the flood. So it gives you a much more vivid account of like why it all happened. It also emphasizes that the angels, they didn't just sleep with the women, they taught them secrets, like how to make metal, how to make swords, so the idea that a lot of knowledge important for civilization came through this kind of transgression. And so the Enoch stuff is really interesting. And it was very important. And let me tell you one way that it's it like Tertullian wrote a commentary on it, and meaning like, and tried to get a really Christian message from from that text I just described. And what he emphasizes, and here the idea is like Christians reading this as scripture, and what Tertullian emphasized is this scriptural tale teaches us that women should dress modestly, like, and that they should not wear makeup, because part of the things that the angels reveal are things of like cosmetics and things. So you definitely have like a kind of scriptural thing going on in like early Christianity, that like it just doesn't, not all of it fits with our Bible, and not all of it fits with the kind of the Apocrypha politics of Martin Luther. There's a whole other world, like there's whole worlds out there that like a lot of us don't really have a sense of. And that like just looking at our Bibles, you kind of miss stuff. That's kind of one of the main things I want people to understand. Like our Bible is really important, but like, and I'm not trying to dismiss that, but like if you ask yourself not just what our understanding of scripture is, but like what those earliest Christians, how they thought scripture was, like you get a window in a whole different Christian world. I guess is the point.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was Tertullian, Irenaeus, Origen, and Clement. They either advocated as canonical or consider it authoritative.
Yeah.
So they'll use phrases like "for Scripture says," "for it is written," stuff
Hmm.
like that. Of
Yeah.
course, the biblical writers, Saint Peter or Second Peter, Jude. So that's really interesting. And later in other interviews, I'm going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they interact with Enoch, which is
Yeah.
really, really interesting. Some argue that it was definitely scripture, but
Well, they're
that's maybe for
using
a different conversation. Yeah.
they're copying it like they're copying it, they're using it. You see the influence of Enochic ideas in other texts. It's definitely
Hmm.
like affecting how they like there's like Enoch, and maybe I should mention this, he's in Genesis. He's the seventh generation after Adam, and he gets revered in the Hellenistic period as this great antediluvian sage. And the idea, like, he's associated with books. Here, let me give you one example. We have one version of Genesis from Qumran that has all these retellings of the text. And you know the story in Genesis 12 where Abraham and Sarah go down to Egypt, and like where he says, "Oh, tell them you're my sister." In one version of that story we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls, when the Egyptians go up to Abraham, it says that he's reading a book by Enoch. Like so there's a sense that like that people, these ancestors, the patriarchs, were reading these books from these earlier patriarchs, and that Enoch had kind of respect, and we see that in Jude, like there, like you saw language of "it is written," or the verb there is prophesy, that Enoch was understood as a prophet. When it quotes the citation from Enoch, it says Enoch prophesied, yada yada yada. And which you actually see retained in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The title for the book in their language, like Ge'ez or classical Ethiopic, it's Mitzchafa Chanoch Nabi, the book of Enoch the prophet. So meaning and if we were all Ethiopians, like most of your listeners would know, like, yeah, he's a prophet, just like Isaiah or Jeremiah, or like he's one of the prophets, you know. So um uh, um yeah, so Enoch is really important. We can talk more about that, or we can go to another part if you'd like, Zach.
Okay. Yeah, let's keep on going there. So, back to the Septuagint
Yeah,
conversation. So, um, the question I have for you is, do we have any idea if the extra apocryphal books that are in there that are not in your typical Old Testament canon,
yeah.
are they considered canon in that time period? Because it's really interesting because each different little set of texts have different books in it. There's no standardization.
Yeah, yeah. So we see this happening, and you see with these early Christian authors, like I mentioned, you find efforts like with Athanasius, or other folks like Jerome, who, like, authoritative, important Christians, saying like our scripture should be this and this and this. And now one overarching issue is sort of like, well, how did those early Christian leaders saying those things relate to what early Christians were doing?
Hmm.
Meaning, like today, so let's say, like, if Trump gives some sort of executive order, like, this is wrong or that's wrong.
You still there? Looks like we cut out.
There, are we there?
Yep, we're here.
Oh, okay.
You can keep going.
And
I don't know what
and
happened.
Okay, and then, but like back then, they didn't. There's no social media. Like, and the whole idea of writing texts, and well, you could write texts, but getting them to kind of spread uniformly across all sorts of different Christian groups, what like was a messier thing. So meaning, so you one of the odd things is you have at the time early Christian leaders saying, you know what, our Old Testament should be more like the Hebrew Old Testament and should be following the Hebrew canon. This is very much Jerome's point. But then the Septuagint is just like, for a lot of Christians, that's just their Bible. They're writing in Greek, they're reading it in Greek, and there isn't a category for, like no sense that like some part represents the Apocrypha, some that some like that's just what their Bibles, their scriptures are. And when you understand that these things could be handwritten, and that it would take hours and hours and hours and hours to do, that affects like the number of books in it. Like meaning like let me give you an example, Zach. Like if you were to ask me to write out the whole Bible, like that'd take a long time. Like and part of like part of you would be like, like, do you need the whole thing? Do you need the whole thing? You know what I mean? Like, so you see that, like, because of the medium in which the text was written, like handwritten, that allowed a kind of local variation that like the whole idea of an authoritative, like, oh, this is our canon. You have efforts to do that, but I don't think those authoritative statements filtered out in the way like an authoritative thing from the president would today. You see what I mean? So a lot of people were just reading their scriptures in Greek, and that's what their scriptures were. But like someone like Jerome was that like you're doing it
Oh, we cut out again.
called he called it in Latin Hebraica Veritas, the Hebrew truth. And when he was the translator of the Vulgate Bible, which became the common form of the Bible in Latin in Europe for like well over 1,000 years. And it's interesting. And what he very clearly did, like in Bethlehem in Palestine in like the late 4th century, he was translating it not from the Greek, but from the Latin, from the Hebrew into Latin. Like, and that was very, very important for him. And everyone was reading it in Greek, but he was like, no, you're doing it wrong. Like it was kind of a fringe idea at the time. But then when you imagine, well, so he was doing that in the 4th century, but then you imagine like all of the scripture, the Bible being copied like by different communities like over centuries. A lot of those books in like pretty much all of those books in the Greek Septuagint are in became part of the Latin Vulgate Bible. Like meaning so so the because a lot of people understood that larger Greek canon as just what their scripture was. So they started just translating these things into Latin, and over time, like those just became part of the biblical text, even though this is exactly what Jerome was trying to fight against. So the Hebrew canon basically won for centuries, and like the Vulgate Bible has pretty much all of these texts, even the ones that we, like we don't have the Tobit or Judith, the stuff that we don't have in the Hebrew Bible. You see what I mean? Like Zach, like so there were ancient efforts to control the canon, and they used the Hebrew canon as a way to do that. But how successful they were is really debatable, and it has to do with what kind of authority did they actually have. Like if you read their text, oh, that's authoritative, but like how that filtered out to like actual Christians like across Europe and North Africa and the Middle East, like it's a whole other story. The devil's in the details, and that longer Greek canon just won out until the Reformation, we could say.
Wow, yeah, that's pretty crazy. I did want to just mention real quick the KJV. So
Yeah.
it's one of the first texts, or the first text, I can't remember, that has a separate section for what they call the Apocrypha.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And now Luther had one about 70 years later, so the King James wasn't the first. But like this is a great point to stress that like when we see the emergence of the Protestant tradition, we see the idea that and here I want to emphasize the middle section here. This is the table of contents for the original King James from 1611. And notice here that it does not just have two sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament, it has three.
Hmm.
Now, and the first thing I want to stress is based on, like if you're kind of scratching your head at this point, that's fine, because I had just emphasized that in early Christian context, the term apocrypha was very explicitly not a biblical category. But now, like the first Protestants have like there's something called biblical apocrypha, like a category of biblical literature called the Apocrypha. And why this is kind of an odd story, but I think it has to do with how Martin Luther and some of these other folks were reading Jerome. And here the idea is that Jerome was saying different things at different times. In a couple texts, he talks about these books in the Christian scriptures which are not in Hebrew, meaning like here, I mean, let's call it the Greek plus books in the Septuagint which are not in the Hebrew Bible. It's about 14 of them. Like it's on the list that Zach was talking about: Tobit, Judith, First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, and at one point he says all of those things should be removed into the Apocrypha. And it's a debate, but in the context, I think what he means is that stuff should just be taken out, period, not in the Bible. But in another place, he talks about those books being basically um, should that those let's call them the Greek plus books, the books in the Greek, the Christian Greek Bible, but not in the Hebrew canon. Tobit, Judith. Another part of Jerome's writings, he basically says those books should not be used for church doctrine, but are good for Christians to read. That they so that they are uplifting, that they are important, like for moral formation. So let's call it a second category of scripture. Like it's kind of like, so the idea that like so that there's canon, and then but there's stuff that people should still be reading, but the basis shouldn't be the basis of church doctrine. And what I suggest in the book is Luther and these other, they really like Jerome, and they kind of gave let's call it a canonical reading of Jerome, and they basically, I suggest, combine those two ideas. And so now they removed those books into the Apocrypha, but now Apocrypha is not understood as a non-biblical category. It is now a category of scripture. So everything. Can we go back to the King James title page, Zach? Because you can see this there. So here, like the second book is the books called the Apocrypha, and you can see what they are: First Esdras, Second Esdras, Tobit, Judith. And can you just pull it back a little bit? There's one important thing I want to show, that like for these like okay, yeah, hold it there, because for these first Protestants, they very much took this Jerome idea that like all the stuff in the Apocrypha they took out of the Old Testament. So meaning, if you look at the Catholic Old Testament, there's no section called Apocrypha. All that stuff in that Apocrypha section and what you're looking at, that stuff is just in the Catholic Old Testament. The Catholic Old Testament is larger than the Protestant Old Testament by quite a bit. I mean, the amount of books we're talking about is roughly equivalent to the New Testament. So not a small amount of material. But what I'd emphasize is the idea that for these people, this they didn't. So the point is, these first Protestants did not remove these books from the Bible. They removed them from the Old Testament. And you can see this in like Luther's Bible, like the Wittenberg Bible from 1534. He has a cover page for the Apocrypha, and there he basically says these aren't regarded in the same way as scripture, but are good to read. Like Jerome, they wanted to, and he got that idea from Jerome. So what these first Protestants wanted to show was that the books in the Apocrypha had a kind of secondary status, like less important, but still important. That's what I want to stress. And they wanted people to read this. Like Martin Luther, in his translation, he included like forewords for most of these books, like in the Apocrypha. And it's really interesting. Some of these books he really liked. Some of them he even called inspired and holy. and oh my God, he loved First Maccabees, like all of this kind of war, like he's like First Maccabees is like a model for like for Christians, meaning like in the context of him fighting the Catholic Church. It's like the idea that kind of it kind of the book got him all fired up for his fights against the Catholic Church. But he put it in the Apocrypha. And here the idea, the key point for those folks is they took literally this idea that Jerome had, that the Old Testament should be the translation of Hebrew texts. And so every book, because like I said, some of those Septuagint books were not in the Hebrew canon. Some of those Septuagint books, which had been Christian scripture for a long, long time, like we didn't have them in Hebrew. And so from that early Protestant perspective, those ones had a secondary status. They weren't removed on the basis of problematic content. They were the reason had much to do with more with language and philology. The Old Testament should be the translation of Hebrew texts. Period. That was kind of the idea. So Old Testament books that they didn't have in Hebrew, they put in the Apocrypha. But you can still see that they understood the stuff as scriptural. Like it's interesting, and I want to highlight this in what Zach is showing. When you look at, we know a lot about the translation of the King James, and the initial version had a letter from the translators to the reader, and where they're talking about the work they did, and there they talk about their understanding of Scripture, and they praise Scripture as a gem, as a jewel that they're kind of making available in this translation. And I want to highlight something that, like, I realized reading this book, and maybe other scholars have emphasized this, but I couldn't find it. But look at look at the G, like, that you can see on what Zach has. So the first letter of the title of the first book, like, and writing it in that kind of medieval style where the first capital letter is bigger and fancier. And then you go to the Apocrypha, Zach, and you can see that the first letter of the first book in the Apocrypha is an E. And then you go to the first letter of the first of the first book of the New Testament, it's an M. Gem, meaning like the whole idea of praising Scripture as a jewel is reflected in how they are understanding Scripture. And the point is, for them, that metaphor would not work wouldn't work without the Apocrypha. It's like one of my students said, it's gem, it's not gum. And so my point is, for those early Christians, I'm sorry, for those Protestant reformers, they lowered the status of this stuff, but they thought of it still as Scripture. And in my book, I really try to follow the idea of Luther and then Jerome before him, that this stuff is good to read. And that's why I that's kind of an overarching principle in the book, this idea that I want people to read about these books and learn more about them. So do you have we can follow up, or do you have a question, or I can then the next question is sort of what happened to the Apocrypha, but here I want the listeners to know that the first Protestants had a category of Scripture called Apocrypha, a third category, which is amazing if you think about it. Books that are in the Bible, but not in the Old Testament or the New Testament, and that's a Protestant thing, not a Catholic thing. Like it's just they have a larger Old Testament. It was a Protestant innovation based on their reading of early Christian authors, principally Jerome.
Yeah, that's very
Go
interesting.
ahead.
So my next question for you was, is there a time in history where people started to just universally conclude that the Apocrypha should be let me restart this. Is there a time in history where people started universally concluding that the Apocrypha should be part of the closed off canon?
Well, yeah, I'd say so. Yes, but calling the stuff the Apocrypha, so that's fine. But then you're kind of using that Protestant like this category that Protestants developed
Hmm.
later on. But the short answer is yes. But they weren't calling the stuff the Apocrypha. Earlier on, they weren't calling the stuff Apocrypha.
Yeah. So what we see is the
Like
Apocrypha.
so
Yeah.
this is why like if you go to you go to a Catholic Bible today, they'll have something in the Old Testament called the Book of Tobit, or Judith. It's just there's no Apocrypha. That's not a category for them. It's just their Old Testament has more books. And why is the Catholic Old Testament like that? Because that's what for centuries the Christian heritage was. So the answer to your question is yes. And Martin Luther. So that was the norm. It's hard for us to understand this because we live as Americans in predominantly a Protestant world. But so it's hard for us to understand the norm that Luther and these others were challenging. But what I pointed out in the Catholic Old Testament was the norm. So they weren't calling it Apocrypha. They just had like a larger Old Testament, and Martin Luther as kind of he was a biblical scholar, and he was at like this is all screwed up. Like the Old Testament should be Hebrew texts, and some like Tobit, Judith, like this, or like Wisdom of Solomon and stuff was written in Greek. These kind of scholarly things didn't work up most people, but Luther was a scholar. A lot of these early Protestants were scholars, and that issue worked up them, and but yeah, that gives you what you're getting at is the norm that a lot of those early Protestants were pushing against. And
Hmm.
I'd also emphasize they were trying to echo, meaning like in a way the Reformation isn't the best term for what they were trying to do. They understood that Christianity had over time kind of had become corrupt, had become
Hmm.
less different, alienated from its roots. Like it was a restorate, not a they weren't trying to reform things. They understood it as a restoration, a renewal, and part of that they were trying to renew what Jerome was initially trying to do like 1,000 years earlier. And Jerome basically said the Christian Old Testament should be the Jewish Bible. Even like the Jewish Bible has like a threefold division, like the Tanakh, the law, the prophets, and the writings. Jerome said that's what the Christian Bible should be. Like he really understood that in a literal sense, that and so they were trying to model like Jerome's idea that Hebrew is the key for the Old Testament. So
Yeah.
so I does that get at your question, Zach?
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. So on one hand, you'd say that those texts were kind of mostly or all accepted all throughout, and
Yeah,
then really we see a kind of rejection at different
yeah,
points.
yeah,
Maybe say with Jerome and the
yeah.
Protestant, maybe a little other places as well. But so in other words, it became part of the official canon when everything else became the canon,
Yeah,
right?
yes,
Because it was a part of it the whole time.
yeah. Like yes, but with one nuance. With Luther and some of these other early Christian authors. So the answer to your question is yes, but you see grumbling from Jerome and some of these early Christians. They're kind of like, we know the Christian Old Testament should really be the Hebrew canon, not the Greek canon, the larger canon. So you find some grumblings about this issue like over the centuries, but for most people, like most Christians, that larger Greek canon is basically the what it is, and that's what's reflected in the Catholic Old Testament.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
there's
that,
like we could nuance this, but there's
yeah.
some early Christians to sort of give some nuance to this. But the reformers tried to they were trying to restore a lost conception of Christian scripture is what they were trying to do.
Yeah, I don't think I asked this. I just want to be really clear. So,
Yeah.
uh, Josephus and Four Esdras, do they include these apocryphal texts as part of their scripture?
So it's a great question, and it seems like not using those categories. So
Okay.
Josephus basically says it actually kind of fits with what we see in some of these early Christian authors. Josephus says, yeah, the Jews have 22 books, but like, and then but after the Persian period, so like, but after like from the 4th century or so, like there were some other books, but they're there, but they're not as important. And 4th Ezra, like I said, emphasize there's like 70 other books. So they both have a sense that there's some other books too, but like but they're emphasizing in different ways. One of
Hmm.
the other things that like, and maybe I should have mentioned this earlier, Zach,
Yeah.
is if you look at the books that we call Apocrypha, Tobit, Judith, First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, it actually kind of fits with what Josephus says. Meaning, like in terms of how scholars date this stuff, it's from this. Most of these texts were written in the 3rd century BCE, 2nd century BCE, 1st century, like maybe 1st century CE. So the point is later than the text that most of us would recognize as the Old Testament. It's virtually the same time as the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this stuff was written later. A lot of these apocryphal texts in the Apocrypha themselves are aware of and engaging a scriptural tradition. That's one of the, in a way that you don't find in many of these older like the texts of the Old Testament. So like so the idea is that I'd connect the text in the Apocrypha to the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're written in the same time, but they are, like Josephus suggested, later than a lot of texts that became part of the Hebrew canon. But like so that's one way of understanding. There's kind of this residual thing where they kind of get accepted, but there's also this understanding that like, well, maybe they're not as important, and they're in Greek, and then they're maybe a little bit later. Um, uh, um, and then Luther, as a scholar, knew all that stuff, and he tried to sort of reinvent Christianity, that sort of where that was kind of built into those complaints were sort of built into the cake.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I didn't want to spend too much time on it because I wouldn't say they're too impactful, but the Mishnah, just real
Yeah.
quick, what do they say about the apocryphal texts?
So they don't. It's a great question. They don't use this category. The Mishnah does not use the category apocrypha. The Jewish term for this is the Sifarim, HaSifarim Chatzinonim, like the outside, literally the outside books, Chitzonim, and that's what they call them. And but they never really. There's no Jewish list of like, here are the outside books. Like one of the things which is so interesting about that 4th Ezra passage, that you cited, is because 4th Ezra gives us a sense of like that text was written around the end of the 1st century CE, when there isn't a sense of like Christianity as we know it or rabbinic Judaism. They're both formed after the wake of the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. And in some ways 4th Ezra resonates with the later Christian. There's so many connections between 4th Ezra and the book of Revelation, but there's all these other connections between 4th Ezra and rabbinic Judaism. And Ezra is hailed in rabbinic Judaism as the one who restores the Torah. And a lot of the terms in rabbinic Judaism is for the like they're called rabbis, obviously, but another important term is chacham, which means the wise. And so the idea that the rabbis like continue this heritage, but in rabbinic Judaism, the wise, like they're saying there are these outside books which Jews shouldn't read, you know, and there's some understanding that they have them. So actually, in a way, this maybe does fit with 4th Ezra. But Ben Sira, the book of Ben Sira, Ecclesiasticus, comes up a lot in rabbinic literature. But they generally don't show there's a real mistrust of books. There really is a canonical consciousness in Judaism. The rabbis are really concerned about claims of revelation that are different from their Hebrew Bible. So like they're like some people like were just like, yeah, the outside books, yeah, don't read them. Don't read them. No good. Very different. Like Jerome said, read these things, you know? So and you got that in the Mishnah. Like one tractate called Sanhedrin. Like you won't get into the afterlife if you read these things, according to Rabbi Akiva.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. So then we have Irenaeus, who is at the end of the 2nd century AD. Uh,
Yeah.
did he comment on these texts at all?
Well, so he cites some of these things that but he uses the term apocrypha for like some groups. Like he's one of those early Christians who is very interested in defining some Christian groups as heretical. And I don't think there's a case where he's listing books, but like he's using the term apocrypha for the books that some of these Christians he doesn't like, what they're like. Those guys are reading apocryphal and spurious scriptures. So he's using it in the sense of like books which people mistakenly read as scriptural, but like it's not always clear what books, because he cites a number of these things, like at the same time he'll cite things like Tobit or whatever as if like not as if it's a problematic thing. So it's he's not using the term apocrypha the way like Martin Luther did, or exactly later on.
Interesting. Okay. And then we have Cyril of Jerusalem. What does he say?
Well, the like I'm not a huge expert in this, but one of the things about the Cyril stuff which is interesting is like he says he's he's writing in Greek, and it fits. So he says that basically the Christian Old Testament essentially fits with the Hebrew canon, and then there's other books which have a secondary status in the during the Old Testament, and there the term is deutero, and your readers might know that after, in response to the Protestant Reformation, like Catholics, that forced Catholics to sort of officially define, like make it come down on these books that the Protestants were officially challenging, and they basically affirmed pretty much all of the books that the Protestants challenged, but they started calling those books deuterocanonical, and drawing from that language of Cyril. Now, what they emphasized by Deutero, it did not mean from the Catholic perspective the stuff is less inspired. What they meant is the point I mentioned earlier, that these texts were written later, like that Genesis and Isaiah or whatever were written earlier, and the stuff that the Protestants are calling Apocrypha were written later. And that's kind of like what they're trying to get with secondary. But the point is that like Cyril is another example where you have some of these early Christians kind of saying, for the Old Testament, yeah, there's the stuff that fits with the Hebrew Bible, and that's the really good stuff. And then there's some other stuff which is really important, but maybe, well, yeah, he uses language of secondary. And again, kind of one of the macro points here is if we're using one term called scripture to understand all of this stuff, we're kind of missing out on how some of these early Christians were thinking about this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. So of course he's 348, 350, at least in his book on catechesis, however you pronounce that.
Yeah.
Uh, you said in your book that he has a proper Old Testament as 22 books, and then he says something that kind of seems to contradict with what you just said. He says have nothing to do with the apocryphal writings. So it seems like he's saying, hey, completely stay away from them. Is that correct, or did I
Yeah.
misread
So
that?
yes, no, but what I'd emphasize, like for him, yeah, like it gets to sort of the wonders, and like the term gets used in different ways. What a lot of these early Christian authors are are using the term apocryphal for stuff which is not in the Bible. Period. Like they don't think of it that like it shouldn't be in their canon. And here the idea is other Christians are reading the stuff as scriptural, and it gets at sort of that different Christians are having different conceptions of scripture, and Cyril and some of these other folks are saying other Christians are getting it wrong, like meaning so you have a scriptural diversity, but you have some of these early Christians saying like that's a problem. But the Deutero stuff is still scriptural for him.
Hmm.
And then that's so think of it as three categories is the idea. Like like um this is like Athanasius has a threefold category too. Like canonical, and then one called, he uses the Greek like anagignoscosema, like that which is read, and apocryphal. And like apocryphal is just like not biblical at all. It's don't read it, like bad, don't read it. But the stuff which should be read, lower than what he calls canonical, but still transmitted, like still in the Greek scriptures,
and good to read. And that's kind of what Cyril is doing with Deutero. And then, but like, I think what you're getting at is then for the reformers to kind of come up and say that, yeah, we're going to put like Apocrypha for the early stuff is such a non-biblical category, period. Like it's just, Christians shouldn't read this stuff, anything called Apocrypha. And then like the first Protestants make a category of scripture called Apocrypha. You see what I mean? There's kind of like a non sequitur there, which I think you're kind of getting at. The reformers those first Protestants were trying to echo what like those early Christians were doing, but they did it in a way like if Jerome up in heaven was like watching this Luther, I think he'd be his head would spin, you know, so the key issue is the term Apocrypha gets used in some different ways.
Yeah, yeah, a bit anachronistic there.
Yeah.
Um, but then that's really, really interesting because if I see the word deuterocanonical, or in this case just
Yeah.
deuteros, then I'm gonna think, oh, okay, that's part of the text, and then there's a conversation of the apocryphal writings. Those aren't in there, but that just implies that there's a whole conversation still going on about
Yeah.
what's in there.
Yeah, the Deutero stuff for Cyril was in there. Like most of the stuff, I'd go back to the point. If you look at the contents of the Septuagint, which became the Christian Old Testament, it had a whole bunch of books, most of which are in the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, the Psalms, Isaiah, but it has a number of other books, about 14, which are not in the Hebrew Bible and not in the Bible for Protestants today, like Tobit, Judith, and that's kind of this. So the Hebrew canon and the secondary stuff, they're kind of getting at the distinction between the let's call it the early Christian Greek canon and the early Christian Hebrew canon, and the Greek one was larger, and Jerome really wanted this Hebrew canon thing, but so did Luther.
That's really interesting. So we got about a few left, but we've been going on a little bit more than an hour. Are you okay to keep going?
We can finish up, but yeah, like if it's fine with me, it's fine with you.
Okay, all right, all righty. So Athanasius. So uh, if people didn't already notice, we've made a big jump from someone like Irenaeus to Jerome, Athanasius, Cyril of Alexander, or of Jerusalem. Sorry. So that's a long time period. But yeah, let's keep going here. What does Athanasius say about the apocryphal
So
texts?
Athanasius Athanasius is very important in what became foundational Christianity for a lot of people. So meaning like a lot of stuff that people would today recognize as um, um, foundational in Christianity, like Athanasius is one of the first people to say that. Like the earliest examples we have of saying like this is the Christians had something called the New Testament, and these are the books of the New Testament that match ours exactly. Athanasius is the first example we have of that, like from like 367 CE. He was an advocate of like the Nicene Creed, which is not. I don't think it's something the Baptists say in their like church services, but in many like the Episcopalians, for example, like it's foundational for like for a lot of Christians today. Like they hear that every Sunday, and Athanasius was a big promoter of the Christology and the theology of the Nicene Creed, for example. And so what Athanasius was also railing against other forms of Christianity that didn't fit with that. He was and he was angry that people were thinking of that Enoch wrote scriptures. He was a big like he despised the kind of Christians that later became that were understood as Gnostic, which is also in Egypt. Like at the same time that Athanasius wrote, like some monks were like hiding in the desert, like their writings, because there was a sense that like that it represented a form of Christianity which was losing out in what was becoming normative. and Athanasius had clear ideas of what should be scripture, and he was another of these kind of influential scripture early Christian authors who were advocating for a kind of an old Christian Old Testament based on the Hebrew canon. And like I said, he had this threefold category. What it called it canonical, and the anagignoskomema, the that which is read, and then the apocryphal. And apocryphal is like, no, it's out. It's not scripture at all. But the idea that that some texts are called canonical, and that some texts are good to read, but like the stuff that he called that is exactly the stuff in the Septuagint, in the it's like the Wisdom of Solomon and Judith. And it's interesting, so the books the Protestants call Apocrypha, the books that the Catholics call deuterocanonical. And you go to the Eastern Orthodox, like the Russian Orthodox or the Greek Orthodox, that all that stuff in the Greek in the Catholic Old Testament is in theirs too. But the category they have for it is exactly the one that Athanasius used, the anagiskonema, like that which is read. So it became a modern category based on the what the Protestants were doing. So the idea that it's another example of this point I want the readers to get, that these early Christian authors were defining scripture not simply as one thing, but that some they were using language of canon, and others that stuff that they good to read, very important, but secondary status. But all of that was in the Septuagint. The stuff they were calling canonical, the stuff they were calling that which should be read. The idea of kind of thinking of the Septuagint as more like an anthology, a library, like not simply the Bible the way we understand it, because we would understand the Bible as only canonical texts. You see what I mean? Like the idea that there's this kind of there's a broader array, there's kind of a hierarchy there, but all of it becomes what we would call biblical, if that makes sense.
A fun quote that Athanasius gives is, "Who has
Exactly.
made the simple folk believe that those books belong to Enoch, even
Yeah.
though no scripture existed before Moses?" Burn.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's you go to the New Testament, you go to the earlier, like in the 2nd century, Christians are just citing the stuff as scripture. So it falls out, the Enochic stuff falls out of for a lot of people. It's like those Septuagint manuscripts, they don't have Enoch. It's kind of, there's like a 4th century push against it. And that Athanasius point text that you showed, it highlights that.
Interesting. Yeah. All right. What about Jerome? So Jerome's very influential. You already talked about him. Is there anything else you wanted to add about his views on
I think
this?
I highlighted the key points, but what I guess the key thing I would stress about Jerome is that he had the idea. So for us, the idea that the Old Testament should be based on Hebrew texts is kind of like, well, yeah, that's kind of obvious. And Jerome had that idea, was a big believer in it, but that made him an outlier at the time. Like he was a more extreme believer of this than he was really a Christian scholar, like he knew Hebrew when very few Christians did at the time, and he pushed this to a degree that very few people did. But as an early and then what the reformers were trying to do, put into practice, they tried to put into practice this Jerome's ideal. Yeah, and like I said, he used this category Apocrypha, but it's not clear that was a biblical category for him. But yeah. I could go on about Jerome, but those are the highlights I'd emphasize.
I see. All right. Yeah, and just real briefly, I was hoping you would comment on. There is a discussion of whether he changed his mind.
Yeah.
Could you just briefly talk about your view, or maybe is there a scholarly consensus on that?
No, well, scholars are aware that there's real differences of opinion. Meaning, because Jerome was so important. Meaning, he was a scholar, so he wrote a lot, and in his own like later on and in his own time, he was understood as important. And meaning like if someone is important, like as understood as really important in their own time, there's really an impulse to like save everything. Like Martin Luther, people understood Martin Luther King in his time was really important. So meaning like, so in terms of his papers and all like there was a real emphasis on sort of preserving everything. And Jerome was like, it was like that with Jerome in the fourth century. And so meaning like we have just volume, there's a lot. And in the same way, like so the point I'd emphasize, like let's say someone did this to you, Zach, later, and like that you have like late in later centuries, they have like 30 or 40 years of what you wrote. Like it'd be pretty easy to find, I guess, that like, well, in this one thing you say this, but in this other thing you say that. It's you see what I mean? You're reading it as kind of one corpus. It's easy to kind of think of it as, well, that's different from that. But like in the actual kind of like people's ideas are change, and there's different, like what you over time you can have different opinions. Like there's this that actually kind of fits with how people live. But when you kind of read it as one corpus, the whole thing can kind of gets read in this kind of biblicizing way, and there's an emphasis that differences are a problem. And I don't think Jerome so people read Jerome in this kind of canonical way, like particularly these early Protestants. That's how I would understand it. But you can definitely find, so he normally doesn't like this. The Apocrypha is a bad category for him, but you can find some stuff in there where he has some different views. And what I tried to argue is I think Luther was trying to harmonize these different views about the Apocrypha, which results in this very strange innovation of a biblical category called Apocrypha, which for Jerome would just, I think, make no sense, or like Athanasius. Because Apocrypha was explicitly a non-biblical category, you know?
Yep.
And now, and I guess one thing like I'd like to highlight a little bit is and we like I don't think this is on your questions, but one important thing is what happened to the Protestant Apocrypha. Because when like if you, most people, the vast majority, like what happened, the vast, and I'll just say this very quickly, but like it's because you go to the mainstream Protestant view, like with that you see with the in the Church of England with King James, you see it with in the Lutheran Church in Germany, is the Apocrypha is an inspired category of Scripture. Like it's there, like it's part of Scripture, exactly what we saw in the King James Bible. It's there, period. Now this was the main line. Let's call it the official Protestant view. Now what a lot of Protestants were saying, like meaning like one important thing to understand about the Protestant Reformation is that it didn't just wasn't just one group. You had all of these. It opened up the doors, and you had all of these different groups, like starting to kind of express their Christianity in different ways. And many of these became foundational in the American context, like the Baptists very much come out of this, and a lot of them were more on sort of the radical progressive side, very with at the time an anti-monarchic, but like, and those guys, many of those radical Protestants did like were just as angry against the mainstream Protestant line as they were against the Catholics. And so a lot of Protestants really did not like that their Bible had a section called Apocrypha. And it became kind of a wedge issue at the time. They didn't like it because there was just this rabid anti-Catholicism which was fueling a lot of this. And for a lot of those people, they understood the Protestant category Apocrypha, the scriptural category Apocrypha, as a problem, as like, oh, like our leaders have Catholic books in our Bible. This is horrible. Which is at one level I find very strange. I mean, like Genesis is a book in the Catholic Old Testament. Isaiah is, like, no one, that's not a problem. But the stuff that where there was this difference, like in the Apocrypha, Protestant Apocrypha, and the Catholic Old Testament, and ironically, Luther put made this a section so people could read this stuff, and so it could be preserved, but not in the Old Testament. But having it one category made it easier to take out. And so you began to like find printing of the Bible that didn't include it, made it cheaper, made it easier. And a key part of where I think this is important for North American readers of this stuff, like some of those radical Protestants who hated the King James Bible, did not like the Apocrypha, were the Puritans. So when like they came here and 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 um and like they started practicing Christianity their own way, like some of the earliest Bibles here, they're like, we are not printing this stuff with an Apocrypha section. So and at the time it was like this wedge issue, but then as Protestantism became the norm, became the hegemonic norm in the American context, like people began to forget that they got so worked up against hating the Apocrypha, and it became kind of all just a forgotten thing. And then that leads to sort of this weird moment where all like a lot of Protestants are in now, where like there were books that were considered scripture for for centuries by all Christians, and then for millions of Christians still are today, but a lot of people like have never heard of these books before, Tobit and Judith. And that weirdness is one of the central points in this conversation I want people to understand. And like and the book is designed for people like that. Like you can read more about them. But it's like it's forgotten scripture, you know? So the loss of the Protestant Apocrypha is a key part of the story.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting there. All right, just to keep going here. So we talked about Jerome. What about Augustine? So
Augustine wrote
Augustine, yeah, keep going. Yeah.
yeah, Augustine wrote wrote in Latin, obviously, and he had no problem with the, he cites the and has no problem with the longer Greek Septuagint canon. Like, so he wasn't one of these leaders to say like, oh yeah, like Christians, the Christian Old Testament should be following the 22 or 24 Hebrew books. Like
Mhm.
he had like the books in the Septuagint, like that's his Bible. Like, so he cites Tobit as scripture. He has no problem with the longer canon.
Hmm.
Period.
Interesting.
He doesn't mind it. He doesn't mind it.
Hmm. All right, and then we have fast forward quite a long time. Well, actually, I almost there. Then we have the Galatian Decree in the end of the 5th century. What does
Yeah,
it comment
Galatians.
about that?
So it's what I think is, so that like it's in the form of a papal decree from the 6th century. It maybe have been like I cited in the book. It might have been like a little bit later. What's
Mhm.
important there is an example. I use it in the book as an example of how people are using the term apocrypha, because there you have like a listing of what books are considered scripture. And here a lot of this basically mirrors the books in the Septuagint. That scriptural list includes Tobit and Judith, but there they use the apocrypha as a non-biblical category. But like me, like, which is it's and here like the category non-biblical as a textual category is really, in principle, really big. Like any book which is not in the Bible is non-biblical. You know what I mean? So they use it, not apocrypha. Like there's this list that goes on and on. It's like dozens of books. Like so there's an awareness that there's all these other books, but they hate them. They call them apocryphal. Like it's not, and most of these books like haven't survived. We're not really sure like if these actually, in many cases, if they were real books or not. But they like say like, nope, like it's a list of banned books. Do not read the following books, and if you do, like you'll go to hell. Like, and so the idea is they're using the term apocrypha for forbidden, like unsanctioned books. Very different than the Protestant use of the term is like, oh, here's a category in scripture we're going to call apocrypha. That's the point I want you to understand, Zach. You get that?
Yeah,
you
makes
kidding me?
total sense. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. All right. So then we fast forward to the 16th century Council of Trent, and this
Yeah.
made a really big impact. Could you tell us about what happened here?
Yeah. The Council of Trent is a big part of what we call the Counter Reformation. So you begin to have all these Protestant, like the Luther and these other folks are breaking away from the Catholic Church, making really important claims, strong claims about you know like how Christians should understand Scripture, how Christians should understand sin, how Christians should understand salvation in ways that are really different from the Catholic norms that were the dominance of the day. Now, this forced the Catholic Church to respond to these things, and that's what the Council of Trent did. And and the Council of Trent, it came up, one part of it. It went on for a number of Catholic scholars meeting and deciding these things over about 20 years or so in the 1500s. And the key part for our purposes is you basically have an official list. What Luther's challenge to the Old Testament forced the Catholics to define their Old Testament, what books include it. And basically, they defend all the books that Luther challenged, meaning all the books that are in the Catholic Old Testament that he said, no, they shouldn't be there. He took out. He took out, and then the Catholic, that list was basically like, nope, those books are inspired. They should be there should be. There's no reason for them to be removed. They're just going to continue being part of the Old Testament, meaning no change. They had been part of the Catholic Old Testament, and this Protestant challenge is invalid, and we're going to keep it. And we that's that's the case with most of the books, but there's a couple books that actually Luther and the Council of Trent agreed on, like Second Esdras, the one that you cited, and it's interesting, in the 16th century there was a form of the Catholic Bible called the Sixto Clementine Bible, which was the norm for about 300 years, and it actually had an appendix after the New Testament, included three of the books we're talking about: First Esdras, Second Esdras, and the Prayer of Manasseh. And there's an emphasis of that they don't so books that the Council of Trent did not affirm as the Old Testament, but a lot of these books had kind of scriptural cred for centuries, and they wanted to emphasize that they didn't want these books to be lost into obscurity and forgotten, is what that said. But then Catholics haven't been using that Bible for about 150 years, so it kind of did get lost, to obscurity. But you but the Council of Trent is basically the church's response to Luther.
Fascinating. All right. And then there is the Galatian decree. So what happened there?
Oh, well, that's what we mentioned that. That's that papal decree from that's attributed to a 6th century pope, the Galatian decree.
Oh, maybe I mistyped something in there. Oops. That's awkward.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah, I
not
did. Yeah,
like
okay.
Galatian. Oh, did I it's not like Galatians, like the letter to it's the Galatian. It's because there was one pope that it's attributed to,
Yeah.
Galatius.
Yeah, I had it as 16th century. I added an extra one in there.
Oh, it's okay. It's all right.
Yeah.
Scribal errors happen.
There you go.
Biblical scholars love this. Love this stuff.
That's awesome. All right. Well, I really do appreciate you coming on here. This is really, really fascinating and intriguing, and I hope people get your book and want to learn more about this and look more into the topic of the Apocrypha, apocryphal texts, and which also include the Book of Enoch and Jubilees, which are really interesting in their own right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on here. Any last thoughts before you get going?
I'd say the last point I'd emphasize is, if you've been intrigued by this discussion, or if you've heard of let me give one story, and then it will be end. So one of my this is the kind of thing I want people to kind of for whom the book is written. One of my students, I was teaching a class on this stuff, and one of the students basically said, like, he was an evangelical, and he went to the wedding of a friend, of a Catholic friend, and at that wedding he heard a reading from scripture from the book of Tobit, and his father did, and the father found that really interesting because he thought he knew scripture, and like, I know scripture really well, I think it's really important, but like, Tobit, what are you talking about? I never heard of that. And so he talked about this to his son, who was in my class, and the son was able to say, like, well, I'm learning in this class this and this and this. And the father was like, cool. And that sort of thing, like, I like that sort of thing that is the book is designed for. So like, the idea that you will hear a little something, that someone who didn't know that these things existed, and then you hear a little something like First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, Apocrypha, like, and you want to learn a little bit more, I'd like to learn a little bit more about that. Well, the book is for you. That's what is like. It's not written for scholars who know about these texts. It's written for sort of ordinary people who would like to learn more about this stuff. And I'd say like you guys can reach your own conclusions, but I very much agree with Luther that the stuff is good to read. So I'll leave it right there, Zach.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the extra thoughts there. Yes, yes, definitely worth
Okay.
reading. Well, awesome. I appreciate it. And in the future, we'll have to have you on about the Nag Hammadi texts, maybe more Dead Sea Scrolls, and then you're also writing on demons. So hopefully we'll have you on for that too.
Yeah. Demons. Yeah, like I'd be happy to talk about demons. That's the project I'm working on. They're coming out of my ears these days. I'm thinking about demons a lot. All right. So this is it, Zach.
Yep, this is it. All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks. Bye bye.